The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble corridors of Valdoria Palace as Captain Marcus Thorne adjusted his ceremonial armor for what he believed would be another routine day of royal protection. At 35, Marcus had served the royal family of Valdoria for over a decade, rising through the ranks from a simple palace guard to the captain of the Royal Protection Unit. His weathered face bore the marks of countless hours spent in training yards and battlefields, but his steel-gray eyes remained sharp and vigilant. The Kingdom of Valdoria had enjoyed peace for nearly 2 decades under the reign of King Edmund the Wise and his beloved Queen Isabella. Their marriage had been a love match that captured the hearts of the people, and their children represented the future of the realm. Crown Prince Alexander, now 28, was known for his diplomatic skills and genuine care for the common folk. Princess Charlotte, barely 8 years old, had become the darling of the kingdom, with her bright smile and curious nature that reminded everyone of her mother's youth. However, not all was harmonious within the palace walls. 2 years ago, tragedy had struck when Queen Isabella died suddenly from a fever that swept through the capital. The kingdom mourned deeply, but none more so than King Edmund, who seemed to age years in the span of months. In his grief and loneliness, the king had made a decision that divided the court and worried many loyal servants. He had married Lady Margaret of House Blackmore, a widow from a neighboring duchy known more for her political connections than her warmth. Lady Margaret, now queen consort, had arrived at court with her own ambitions and a cold demeanor that stood in stark contrast to the beloved late Queen Isabella. She was a woman of sharp features and sharper tongue, whose dark hair was always pulled back severely and whose green eyes seemed to calculate every interaction for potential advantage. Marcus had watched with growing concern as the new queen established her influence over the grieving king. She had brought with her a retinue of servants and advisors from her former home, slowly replacing long-serving palace staff with her own people. The changes were subtle at first: different protocols, new rules for court etiquette, and restrictions on who could access certain areas of the palace. But it was her treatment of Princess Charlotte that truly troubled Marcus. The little princess, who had been the light of the palace since her birth, began to withdraw into herself. Her laughter, once a common sound echoing through the halls, became rare. Her bright eyes, so like her late mother's, often seemed clouded with confusion and sadness. Marcus first noticed the change during his evening rounds, 3 months after the royal wedding. He had passed by the princess's chambers and heard muffled crying from within. When he discreetly inquired with her nursemaid Sarah, an elderly woman who had served the royal family for 30 years, she had hesitated before speaking. "The new queen," Sarah had whispered, glancing around nervously. "She has very strict ideas about how the princess should behave. She says Princess Charlotte is too spoiled, too free with her affections. She believes the child needs discipline." The word discipline had sent a chill through Marcus's heart. He had grown up in a household where discipline meant harsh words and harsher hands, and he had sworn never to allow such treatment of those under his protection. But what could a guard do when the threat came from within the royal family itself? Over the following weeks, Marcus began to pay closer attention to the interactions between Queen Margaret and Princess Charlotte. During formal court gatherings, he watched as the queen would grip the child's shoulder tightly when she fidgeted, leaving small bruises that the princess would try to hide beneath her sleeves. He observed how the queen's voice would take on a venomous quality when addressing the child, though always quietly and away from the king's hearing. The breaking point came on a gray October morning when Marcus was making his routine inspection of the palace's eastern wing. The sound of raised voices drew his attention to the Queen's private sitting room, a lavishly decorated chamber that had once been Queen Isabella's favorite retreat. Through the slightly open door, he could see Queen Margaret standing over Princess Charlotte, who was kneeling on the cold marble floor. "You stupid, ungrateful child," the Queen hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "How dare you embarrass me in front of the foreign ambassadors? Your behavior is a disgrace to this family and to your father's memory of your precious mother." Princess Charlotte, tears streaming down her face, tried to speak. I didn't mean to. Silence. Queen Margaret's hand struck the child's cheek with a sharp crack that echoed through the room. You will learn your place, or I will teach it to you in ways your father need never know about. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice as he watched the 8-year-old princess cradle her reddened cheek, her small body trembling with fear and pain. This was no longer about discipline or royal protocol. This was cruelty pure and simple, directed at a defenseless child who had already lost her mother and was now losing her sense of safety in her own home. The queen raised her hand again, and Marcus saw something in Princess Charlotte's eyes that broke his heart, the look of a child who expected pain and had no hope of rescue. In that moment, all thoughts of protocol, rank, and consequences fled from his mind. There was only one thing that mattered: protecting an innocent child from harm. Without hesitation, Marcus pushed open the door and stepped into the room, his hand moving instinctively to rest on the pommel of his sword. His voice, when he spoke, carried all the authority of his years of military training and the steel of his unshakable moral conviction. Step away from the princess, your majesty. Queen Margaret whirled around, her face flushed with anger and surprise. For a moment she was speechless, clearly not expecting to be interrupted in what she had believed was a private moment. When she found her voice, it was shrill with outrage. How dare you enter my chambers without permission, Captain? This is a private family matter, and you have overstepped your bounds considerably. Marcus's eyes never left the queen as he moved protectively closer to Princess Charlotte, who had scrambled to her feet and was now standing behind him, her small hand clutching at his uniform cloak. He could feel her trembling against his leg, and it only strengthened his resolve. My duty is to protect all members of the royal family, your majesty, he replied, his voice calm but firm. That includes protecting them from harm, regardless of its source. The implication was clear, and Queen Margaret's face darkened with fury. She drew herself up to her full height, attempting to use her royal authority to intimidate the guard who dared to challenge her. You forget yourself, Captain Thorne. I am the Queen Consort of Valdoria, and you are nothing more than a servant. How dare you suggest that I would harm a child in my care? I suggest nothing, your majesty, Marcus replied steadily. I state what I have observed. Princess Charlotte bears bruises that were not there yesterday, and I have just witnessed you strike her across the face. The queen's hand moved unconsciously to smooth her hair, a gesture Marcus recognized as one of calculation. She was already planning her next move, considering how to turn this situation to her advantage. The princess is a willful child who requires correction, she said, her voice taking on a more measured tone. As her stepmother, it is my duty to ensure she grows into a proper lady worthy of her royal blood. Surely you, as a loyal servant of the crown, understand the importance of maintaining discipline within the royal household. I understand the difference between discipline and cruelty, your majesty, Marcus replied, and I know that Queen Isabella would never have wanted her daughter to live in fear within these walls. The mention of the late queen was like a slap across Queen Margaret's face. Her mask of royal composure slipped entirely, revealing the calculating and cruel woman beneath. Queen Isabella is dead, she snarled. I am the queen now, and this child will learn to respect that fact, even if it requires harsh lessons, as will you, Captain Thorne. Behind him, Marcus felt Princess Charlotte press closer, seeking protection and comfort. The child's trust in him was absolute, and he knew that he would not let her down. Whatever the consequences might be for his career or his life, he would not allow this innocent child to suffer at the hands of a woman who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to her own power. Perhaps we should discuss this matter with His Majesty, Marcus suggested, though he knew that the grieving king had become increasingly isolated and dependent on his new wife's counsel. I'm certain he would want to know about any concerns regarding his daughter's welfare. Queen Margaret's smile was cold and calculating. Oh, Captain Thorne, I think you'll find that the king trusts my judgment completely when it comes to household matters, especially when it concerns dealing with overzealous servants who have forgotten their place. The threat was clear, but Marcus remained unmoved. He had faced down enemy soldiers on battlefields, and he would not be intimidated by a cruel woman, regardless of her title. His loyalty was to the crown, yes, but more importantly, it was to the principles of honor and protection that had guided his entire life. "Then I suppose we'll see who His Majesty believes," Marcus said quietly. "A guard who has served his family faithfully for over a decade, or a woman who strikes children when she believes no one is watching." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but it was broken by the sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside. Both adults turned toward the door, as Crown Prince Alexander appeared in the doorway, his face immediately darkening as he took in the scene before him. "What is happening here?" he demanded, his voice carrying all the authority of his future kingship. His eyes moved from his stepmother's flushed face to Marcus's protective stance, and finally to his little sister, who was still clinging to the guard's cloak with tears on her cheeks. Queen Margaret was the first to speak, her voice immediately taking on a tone of injured innocence. "Alexander, thank goodness you're here. Captain Thorne has grossly overstepped his boundaries and insulted my authority as queen. I was simply trying to correct Charlotte's behavior, and he burst in here making wild accusations." Prince Alexander's eyes narrowed as he studied the scene more carefully. He had always been intelligent and perceptive, qualities that would serve him well as a future king. His gaze lingered on his sister's reddened cheek and her frightened expression, and Marcus saw understanding dawn in the prince's eyes. "Charlotte," the prince said gently, kneeling down to his sister's level, "come here to me." The little princess hesitated, glancing between her stepmother and the guard who had protected her. Marcus nodded encouragingly, and she slowly moved toward her brother, who gathered her into his arms with infinite gentleness. "Tell me what happened, little sister," Prince Alexander said softly, though his eyes remained fixed on Queen Margaret with an expression of growing anger. Through her tears, Princess Charlotte began to speak in a voice so quiet that everyone in the room had to strain to hear her words. But what she said would change everything, setting in motion events that would shake the very foundations of the royal court and force everyone to choose sides in a battle that would determine not just the fate of a child, but the future of the kingdom itself. As Marcus watched the prince comfort his sister, he knew that there would be no going back from this moment. He had taken his stand, drawn his line in the sand, and whatever came next, he would face it with the knowledge that he had done what was right, regardless of the personal cost. The protection of the innocent was worth any sacrifice, even if it meant standing against the very crown he had sworn to serve. Princess Charlotte's whispered words hung in the air like a death sentence. Through broken sobs, she told her brother about the harsh words, the painful grips, the constant criticism, and the fear that had become her daily companion since Queen Margaret's arrival. Each revelation was like a dagger to Prince Alexander's heart, and Marcus could see the future king's jaw tightening with barely controlled rage. She said that mother would be ashamed of me," Charlotte whispered, her small voice breaking. "She said I was too much like mother, and that's why father doesn't want to see me anymore." The cruelty of using a child's grief against her was breathtaking in its calculated malice. Prince Alexander's face had gone pale, and when he looked up at Queen Margaret, his eyes blazed with a fury that made even Marcus take a step back. "How dare you?" the prince said, his voice low and dangerous. "How dare you use our mother's memory as a weapon against a child?" Queen Margaret had recovered her composure during Charlotte's confession, and now she attempted to regain control of the situation. "Alexander, you must understand that the child is clearly upset and confused. Children often exaggerate when they're—" "Are you calling my sister a liar?" Prince Alexander stood slowly, still holding Charlotte protectively against his chest. At 28, he was tall and imposing like his father, but where King Edmund had become withdrawn and melancholic, Alexander burned with righteous anger. "I'm saying that children sometimes misunderstand adult intentions," Queen Margaret replied smoothly. "I have only tried to provide guidance and structure. Perhaps my methods seem harsh to a child, but your methods." Alexander's voice rose. "Is striking an 8-year-old child part of your methods? Is terrorizing her with lies about our dead mother part of your guidance?" Marcus watched the exchange with growing tension. He could see that Queen Margaret was realizing her position was becoming untenable, and in his experience, cornered predators were the most dangerous. Her eyes had taken on a calculating gleam that made him instinctively move closer to the royal siblings. "I will not be spoken to this way by a boy who has yet to wear a crown," Queen Margaret snapped, her mask finally slipping entirely. "I am your father's wife, your queen, and I will not tolerate this insolence from either you or your pet soldier." The insult to Marcus was clearly intended to redirect Alexander's anger, but the prince was too intelligent to fall for such an obvious ploy. Instead, he gently handed Charlotte to Marcus, who immediately wrapped his cloak around the trembling child. "Captain Thorm," Alexander said formally, never taking his eyes off his stepmother, "please escort my sister to her chambers and ask Sarah to attend her. Also, please send word to Lord Chancellor Morrison that I require his immediate presence in the throne room." "Yes, Your Highness," Marcus replied, understanding immediately that the prince was escalating this matter to the highest levels of court. The Lord Chancellor was the king's chief advisor and the keeper of royal protocol. His involvement would make this a formal matter of state rather than a private family dispute. As Marcus prepared to leave with Charlotte, Queen Margaret made one final attempt to regain control. "Alexander, surely we can resolve this matter privately. There's no need to involve the court in what is essentially a misunderstanding between family members." Prince Alexander's smile was cold and completely without humor. "Oh, but I think there's every need, stepmother. You see, the protection of royal heirs is not a private family matter. It's a matter of kingdom security, and as such, it requires the full attention of the court." The legal implications of his words were not lost on anyone in the room. By framing the situation as a matter of royal protection rather than domestic discipline, Alexander had effectively removed it from Queen Margaret's sphere of influence and placed it squarely within the realm of crown law. Marcus carried Charlotte through the palace corridors, feeling her small body gradually stop trembling as they moved further from the queen's presence. Other guards and servants they passed looked curious about the unusual sight of the captain of the guard carrying the princess, but Marcus's stern expression discouraged any questions. When they reached Charlotte's chambers, Sarah was waiting anxiously. The elderly nursemaid took one look at the child's tear-stained face and red cheek, and her own face hardened with protective fury. "That woman," Sarah muttered as she gently took Charlotte from Marcus's arms. "I've been wanting to speak out for months, but who would believe a servant against a queen?" "Prince Alexander believes," Marcus said quietly, "and now the matter will be brought before the king himself." Sarah's eyes widened, with hope and fear in equal measure. "Do you think His Majesty will listen? He's been so distant since the Queen's death, so dependent on Lady Margaret's counsel." "I don't know," Marcus admitted, "but I know that Prince Alexander will not let this matter rest, and I know that I will continue to protect Princess Charlotte, whatever the cost." As if sensing the gravity of the adult conversation, Charlotte looked up at Marcus with eyes far too old for her. 8 years. Will you really protect me, Captain Marcus? Even if it makes the Queen angry?" Marcus knelt down so he was at eye level with the child, his weathered face gentle but determined. "Princess, I swear to you on my honor as a knight and my oath as your protector that no one will hurt you while I draw breath. Not the Queen, not anyone." The relief that flooded Charlotte's face was heartbreaking, and Marcus realized just how much fear this child had been carrying. No child should have to live in terror in their own home, especially not a child who had already lost so much. After ensuring that Charlotte was safely in Sarah's care, Marcus made his way to the throne room as Prince Alexander had requested. Word of the confrontation had already begun to spread through the palace's informal networks, and he could see clusters of servants and courtiers whispering among themselves as he passed. The throne room of Valdoria Palace was a magnificent chamber designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. Soaring columns supported a vaulted ceiling, painted with scenes of the kingdom's glorious history, while tall windows let in streams of light that illuminated the golden throne at the far end of the hall. It was here that King Edmund held court, made royal proclamations, and dispensed justice. Prince Alexander was already present when Marcus arrived, along with Lord Chancellor Morrison, a distinguished man in his 60s whose silver beard and sharp eyes spoke of decades of political experience. Also present, to Marcus's surprise, was Sir Geoffrey Blackstone, the kingdom's most respected knight and leader of the Royal Guard. Marcus's own superior officer. "Ah, Captain Thorne," Lord Chancellor Morrison said as Marcus approached. "His Highness has been telling me about this morning's incident. I must say, it's a most serious matter." Marcus inclined his head respectfully. "My Lord Chancellor, I acted according to my oath to protect all members of the royal family from harm. I would make the same choice again." Sir Geoffrey stepped forward, his expression grave. "Marcus, you understand that you've placed yourself in an extremely delicate position. Accusing a queen of child abuse is not something that can be done lightly or without consequences." "I didn't accuse her, Sir Geoffrey," Marcus replied firmly. "I witnessed her actions and intervened to protect Princess Charlotte. The evidence speaks for itself." Prince Alexander nodded approvingly. Captain Thorne acted with honor and courage. He did what any true knight should do when faced with cruelty toward the innocent. Lord Chancellor Morrison stroked his beard thoughtfully. "The question now is how to proceed. This matter cannot be swept aside, but it also cannot be handled carelessly. The reputation of the crown is at stake, as is the stability of the kingdom." "What do you mean?" Alexander asked, though Marcus suspected the prince already understood the political implications. "Your Highness," the Lord Chancellor explained, "Queen Margaret's family controls significant trade routes in the eastern provinces. Her brother commands a considerable military force, and her uncle sits on the High Council of the neighboring kingdom of Astoria. If she is formally accused of misconduct, there could be serious diplomatic and economic consequences." Marcus felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. He had known that challenging the queen would have personal consequences for himself, but he had not fully considered the broader political ramifications. Still, when he thought of Charlotte's terrified face and trembling body, he knew he could not have acted differently. "Are you suggesting we do nothing?" Prince Alexander's voice was dangerously quiet. "Are you saying that political convenience is more important than the safety of my sister?" "Not at all, Your Highness," Lord Chancellor Morrison replied quickly. "I'm simply outlining the complexities we face. We must find a way to protect Princess Charlotte while also protecting the kingdom from potential retaliation." Sir Geoffrey had remained silent during this exchange, but now he spoke up. "There is also the matter of the king's reaction to consider. His Majesty has become quite dependent on Queen Margaret's companionship since Queen Isabella's death. He may not welcome accusations against his new wife." This was the heart of the problem, and everyone in the room knew it. King Edmund, in his grief and loneliness, had allowed his new wife to gradually take control of many aspects of palace life. He had grown increasingly isolated from his children and his advisors, preferring to spend his time in private with Queen Margaret or lost in memories of his departed queen. "Then we present him with facts, not accusations," Prince Alexander said firmly. "We show him the bruises on Charlotte's arms. We have her nursemaid testify to the changes in her behavior, and we have Captain Thorne's eyewitness account of this morning's assault. And if he chooses to believe his wife's version of events? Lord Chancellor Morrison asked gently. The question hung heavy in the air. They all knew that love, or in King Edmund's case, desperate loneliness, could blind a person to truths they didn't want to see. The king might well choose to believe that his wife was being unfairly maligned by jealous courtiers and overprotective servants. Then I will request a formal inquiry under the ancient laws of royal protection, Alexander declared. As heir to the throne, I have the right to demand that any threat to the royal bloodline be thoroughly investigated. Marcus was impressed by the prince's knowledge of royal law, but he could see the concern in Lord Chancellor Morrison's eyes. A formal inquiry would be a public matter, one that could not be contained within the palace walls. It would inevitably become known throughout the kingdom and beyond, potentially causing exactly the kind of diplomatic crisis they were trying to avoid. Before anyone could respond to Alexander's declaration, the great doors of the throne room swung open with a thunderous crash. King Edmund strode into the chamber, his face dark with anger and confusion. Behind him came Queen Margaret, her expression one of wounded innocence and righteous indignation. "What is the meaning of this gathering?" the king demanded, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Why has my wife come to me with tales of insubordination and wild accusations?" Marcus felt his heart sink as he saw the king's appearance. Edmund was barely 50 years old, but grief and isolation had aged him considerably. His once golden hair was now streaked with silver, and his blue eyes, so like Charlotte's, seemed haunted by perpetual sadness. Most troubling of all was the way he stayed close to Queen Marguerite's side, as if drawing strength from her presence. "Father," Prince Alexander began, his voice respectful but firm, "we need to discuss Charlotte's welfare. There have been incidents." Queen Margaret interrupted, her voice pitched perfectly to convey hurt and confusion. "My dear Edmund, your son is referring to my attempts to provide proper guidance to Charlotte. She has become quite willful lately, and I fear that without correction, she will grow up lacking the discipline befitting a princess." King Edmund's gaze moved around the room, taking in the serious faces of his advisors and the determined expression of his son. When his eyes fell on Marcus, there was a flicker of something, perhaps recognition of the guard's long and faithful service. "Captain Thorne," the king said slowly, "my wife tells me that you burst into her private chambers and made serious accusations against her character. Is this true?" Marcus stood at attention, knowing that this moment would define not only his own fate, but potentially the future of Princess Charlotte's safety. "Your Majesty, I witnessed Queen Margaret strike Princess Charlotte across the face. I intervened to protect the princess from further harm. The accusation hung in the air like a blade." Queen Margaret gasped dramatically, pressing a hand to her chest as if physically wounded by the words. "Edmund, you see how they conspire against me," she said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I have tried so hard to be a good mother to your children, to fill the void left by dear Isabella's passing, but they resent me. They hate me for trying to take her place." It was a masterful performance, Marcus had to admit. The queen had positioned herself as the victim, the grieving stepmother trying to do her best in an impossible situation. She had invoked the memory of the beloved late queen, reminding King Edmund of his loss and his loneliness. King Edmund's face crumpled with fresh grief at the mention of his first wife, and Marcus could see Queen Margaret's satisfied smile behind her tears. She knew exactly how to manipulate the king's emotions, how to use his love for Isabella's memory as a weapon against those who would challenge her. "Father," Prince Alexander said urgently, recognizing that they were losing ground. "Look at Charlotte. Look at her face, at the bruises on her arms. Look at how she flinches when Queen Margaret approaches her. These are not the reactions of a child receiving loving discipline." But King Edmund seemed unable to focus on anything beyond his own pain and his wife's apparent distress. "I will not have my wife subjected to these accusations," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Queen Margaret has shown nothing but kindness to my children. If Charlotte is having difficulties adjusting, Perhaps it is because she misses her mother, not because she is being mistreated. Marcus felt his heart breaking for the king, even as he realized the man was choosing comfortable lies over painful truths. Edmund was so desperate to believe that his new marriage could heal his broken family that he was blind to the damage being done to his daughter. "Your Majesty," Lord Chancellor Morrison interjected carefully, "perhaps we could arrange for Princess Charlotte to be examined by the court physician, simply to ensure her overall health and well-being?" It was a diplomatic suggestion that might provide evidence without directly challenging the Queen. But Queen Margaret was too clever to allow even that small concession. "Of course she should be examined," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a delicate handkerchief. "I have nothing to hide. But I insist that the physician also investigate the bruising and marks that might result from Charlotte's own spirited play. The child is quite active, as you know, and children her age are prone to accidents." Marcus realized with growing horror that the Queen had already prepared explanations for Charlotte's injuries. She had been careful, calculating, making sure that any evidence of her cruelty could be explained away as childhood mishaps or necessary discipline. The trap was closing around them all, and Marcus could see that Prince Alexander was beginning to realize the same thing. They had underestimated their opponent, assuming that truth and justice would be enough to prevail, but Queen Margaret was playing a different game entirely, one where political power and emotional manipulation mattered more than facts or evidence. As the debate continued in the throne room, with King Edmund growing increasingly defensive of his wife and increasingly impatient with his son's accusations, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He had sworn an oath to protect the royal family, and that oath extended beyond simply following orders or maintaining protocols. Sometimes, protection meant taking risks that others couldn't or wouldn't take. Sometimes, it meant sacrificing everything to save the innocent. And sometimes, it meant trusting that the truth would eventually prevail, even when the immediate future looked dark and uncertain. Looking directly at King Edmund, Marcus spoke with all the conviction and courage that had carried him through years of military service and moral challenges. "Your Majesty, I formally request to invoke the ancient right of shield testimony." The words, "right of shield testimony," fell like thunderclaps in the throne room, causing everyone present to freeze in shock. Even Queen Margaret's careful mask of wounded innocence slipped momentarily as she realized the significance of what Marcus had just invoked. Lord Chancellor Morrison's eyes widened with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Captain Thorne, do you fully understand what you're requesting?" The right of shield testimony was an ancient law dating back to the kingdom's founding, created during a time when treachery and court intrigue posed constant threats to royal bloodlines. It allowed any sworn protector of the royal family to demand a formal hearing before the assembled court if they believed a member of the royal family was in mortal or significant danger. The law had not been invoked in over a century, and for good reason. If the testimony was proven false or motivated by malice, the penalty was death. "I understand completely, Lord Chancellor," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was risking. "I am prepared to stake my life on the truth of my testimony regarding the treatment of Princess Charlotte." King Edmund stared at his longtime guard with a mixture of confusion and growing alarm. "Marcus, what are you saying? You would risk your life over disciplinary measures?" "Your Majesty," Marcus responded, never breaking eye contact with his king, "I am saying that I have witnessed systematic cruelty toward Princess Charlotte that goes far beyond any reasonable definition of discipline. I am saying that your daughter lives in fear within her own home, and I am saying that as her sworn protector, I would rather die than allow that to continue." The gravity of Marcus's words was undeniable. The right of shield testimony was not something that could be invoked lightly or dismissed easily. Once formally requested, it became a matter of royal law that required immediate attention and resolution. Prince Alexander stepped forward, his face filled with gratitude and concern for the man who was risking everything to protect his sister. "Father, Captain Thorne has served our family faithfully for over a decade. He has saved your life, protected our borders, and shown nothing but honor and loyalty. If he is willing to risk his life to make this testimony, surely that speaks to the seriousness of his concerns. Queen Margaret had recovered from her initial shock and was already formulating her response. My dear Edmund, this is clearly a desperate attempt to undermine my authority and position. This guard cannot accept that the days of permissiveness are over, that Charlotte needs structure and discipline to become a proper princess. But her words rang hollow in the face of Marcus's ultimate sacrifice. The right of shield testimony was sacred, binding, and absolute. No one would invoke it unless they were absolutely certain of their cause, because failure meant not just disgrace, but death. Lord Chancellor Morrison cleared his throat, his legal mind already working through the implications and requirements. Your Majesty, under the ancient laws of Valdoria, the right of shield testimony cannot be refused or delayed. It must be heard within 24 hours before the assembled court, including the royal family, the noble houses, and representatives of the common people. King Edmund looked torn between his loyalty to his wife and his growing realization that the situation had escalated far beyond his control. But surely there must be another way. There is no other way, Father, Prince Alexander said firmly. The law is clear, and Captain Thorne has invoked his right. We must proceed according to the ancient traditions. As if summoned by the gravity of the moment, Sir Geoffrey stepped forward and performed the ritual that would formally begin the process. Drawing his sword, he placed it point down on the marble floor and spoke the words that had been used for centuries. By blade and blood, by crown and kingdom, let all present bear witness that Captain Marcus Thorne of the Royal Guard has invoked his right of shield testimony in defense of Princess Charlotte of Valdoria. Let the great bell be rung, let the noble houses be summoned, and let justice be served according to the ancient laws of our realm. Even as the words were spoken, Marcus could hear the deep, resonant tone of the palace's great bell beginning to ring, its sound carrying across the capital city to announce that something of great importance was happening within the royal court. By law, the noble houses would have to respond to the summons, creating a gathering that would make this matter impossible to contain or ignore. Queen Margaret's face had gone pale as she realized the full implications of what was happening. A public hearing would mean testimony from servants, examination of evidence, and most dangerously for her, the possibility that other victims of her cruelty might find the courage to speak out. This is preposterous, she declared, her voice rising with desperation. I will not be subjected to the accusations of a commoner, no matter what ancient laws he may invoke. I am a queen, descended from noble blood, and I demand... You demand nothing. Prince Alexander interrupted, his own voice taking on the full authority of his future kingship. You are subject to the same laws as every other resident of this kingdom, and those laws will be applied fairly and completely. King Edmund seemed to age years in the span of minutes as the reality of the situation sank in. His quiet life of grief and gradual healing was about to be torn apart by a very public examination of his marriage and his family. Worse still, he was beginning to see cracks in his wife's perfect facade, small inconsistencies and reactions that suggested there might be truth to the accusations being made. Margaret, he said quietly, his voice heavy with exhaustion and growing doubt. Tell me truly, have you been harsh with Charlotte? Have you perhaps lost your temper with her? It was a lifeline, an opportunity for the Queen to admit to minor wrongdoing while avoiding the most serious charges. But Queen Margaret was too proud and too calculating to take it. Instead, she drew herself up to her full height and spoke with cold fury. I have been exactly what that child needed. A firm hand to replace the indulgent softness that has made her weak and spoiled. If providing proper discipline makes me a monster in your eyes, then so be it. The admission was damning, even though she clearly didn't realize it. By referring to Charlotte as that child rather than her daughter or stepdaughter, she revealed the emotional distance and lack of affection that had characterized her treatment of the princess. By describing discipline as something Charlotte needed, she was essentially confirming that she had been the one administering harsh treatment. Marcus saw understanding dawn in King Edmund's eyes, followed immediately by a wave of guilt and self-recrimination. The king was finally seeing his daughter's situation clearly, and the weight of his failure as a father was crushing. "Oh, Charlotte," the king whispered, his voice breaking. "What have I allowed to happen to you?" The next 24 hours passed in a whirlwind of preparation and gathering testimony. Lord Chancellor Morrison worked tirelessly to ensure that the formal hearing would follow all proper protocols, while Sir Geoffrey organized security for what would certainly be a contentious and emotionally charged proceeding. Marcus spent the time preparing his testimony and gathering evidence, though he was no longer working alone. Sarah, the princess's nursemaid, had found her voice, and was prepared to testify about the changes she had witnessed in Charlotte's behavior and demeanor. 2 other servants had come forward with their own observations of Queen Margaret's harsh treatment of the young princess. Most importantly, the court physician had examined Princess Charlotte and documented numerous bruises and marks that were consistent with rough handling and physical punishment. While some injuries could potentially be explained as accidents, the pattern and placement suggested deliberate infliction of pain. Prince Alexander had taken personal responsibility for his sister's protection during this period, never leaving her alone, and ensuring that she was surrounded by trusted servants at all times. The change in Charlotte's demeanor when she was away from Queen Margaret's influence was remarkable. She began to smile again, to speak without fear, and to show glimpses of the bright, curious child she had been before her stepmother's arrival. When the Great Hall was finally prepared for the formal hearing, it presented an impressive sight. Representatives from all the major noble houses had answered the summons, along with senior clergy, military officers, and selected representatives of the common people. The ancient law required that justice be seen to be done by all segments of society, ensuring that no one could later claim the proceedings had been biased or incomplete. King Edmund sat on his throne, looking older and more careworn than ever. Prince Alexander stood at his right hand, while Queen Margaret sat in the Queen's chair, her face a mask of cold fury. Princess Charlotte remained in her chambers under heavy guard, as the law provided special protections for royal children during such proceedings. Lord Chancellor Morrison called the hearing to order with the traditional words, "Let all who seek justice step forward. Let all who would speak truth be heard, and let the ancient laws of Valdoria guide us in our deliberations." Marcus stepped forward to give his testimony, and his words rang clearly through the great hall as he described exactly what he had witnessed and why he had felt compelled to intervene. His account was detailed, specific, and delivered with the quiet conviction of a man who had nothing to hide and everything to lose. When he finished, Queen Margaret's defender, a nobleman from her home region, attempted to discredit his testimony by questioning his motives and suggesting that he had misinterpreted innocent disciplinary actions. But Marcus's reputation for honesty and honor made such attacks ineffective, especially when they were followed by Sarah's corroborating testimony. The elderly nursemaid's words were perhaps even more damaging than Marcus's, because she could speak to the long-term changes in Princess Charlotte's behavior and emotional state, her voice shaking with emotion. She described how a happy, confident child had gradually become withdrawn and fearful. She stopped asking questions, Sarah testified, tears streaming down her face. Princess Charlotte used to be so curious about everything. The flowers in the garden, the paintings on the walls, the stories of her ancestors. But after the new queen arrived, she became quiet and careful, always watching to see if she was doing something wrong. The court physician's testimony provided clinical evidence to support the emotional accounts, documenting injuries that could not reasonably be explained as accidental. When Queen Margaret's defender suggested that active children often acquire bruises, The physician calmly explained the difference between the random marks of childhood play and the specific patterns that indicated deliberate infliction of pain. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Lady Catherine Fairmont, a visiting noblewoman from a neighboring kingdom, requested permission to speak. She had been present at the court for several weeks as part of diplomatic negotiations, and she had observed Queen Margaret's interactions with Princess Charlotte during formal events. "Your Majesty," Lady Catherine said, addressing King Edmund directly, "in my own kingdom, we have unfortunately dealt with similar situations involving the mistreatment of children by those who should protect them. I recognized the signs immediately. The way Princess Charlotte would flinch when Queen Margaret approached, the way she would become very still and quiet in her stepmother's presence, the careful way she would choose her words when speaking in front of her." Lady Catherine's testimony was devastating because it came from someone with no stake in the outcome, no reason to lie or exaggerate. Her diplomatic status and noble birth made her words impossible to dismiss, and her experience dealing with child abuse cases in her own kingdom gave her testimony added weight. As the evidence mounted, Queen Margaret's composure finally began to crack. Her defenders' questions became increasingly desperate, and her own responses grew more shrill and defensive. When pressed about specific incidents, she made the crucial error of claiming that Princess Charlotte was lying or exaggerating, directly contradicting her earlier position that she had done nothing wrong. The contradiction was not lost on the assembled court, and murmurs of disapproval began to ripple through the hall. Even among those who had initially been sympathetic to the Queen's position, support was beginning to erode. King Edmund watched the proceedings with growing horror and shame. Each piece of testimony was like a blow to his heart, forcing him to confront the reality that his desperate need for companionship had blinded him to his daughter's suffering. When Lord Chancellor Morrison finally asked if he had any questions for the witnesses, the king's voice was barely above a whisper. "I would like to speak with my daughter," he said simply. The request was unusual but not forbidden under the ancient laws. Princess Charlotte was brought to the Great Hall, her small hand firmly held by Prince Alexander as they approached the throne. The sight of the 8-year-old girl, so small and vulnerable in the vast chamber filled with adults, brought tears to many eyes. King Edmund left his throne and knelt down to his daughter's level, just as Prince Alexander had done days earlier. When he spoke, his voice was filled with love and regret. "Charlotte, my precious daughter, I need you to tell me the truth about how Queen Margaret has been treating you. I promise that whatever you say, you will be safe and protected." For a moment, Charlotte hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously toward her stepmother. But then she looked at Marcus, standing proudly despite the gravity of what he had risked for her, and she found her courage. In her clear young voice, she told the assembled court about the fear, the pain, the harsh words, and the constant criticism that had become her daily reality. She spoke about missing her mother and being told that her mother would be ashamed of her. She described being afraid to laugh or play too loudly, afraid to ask questions, afraid to simply be a child. When she finished, the great hall was silent, except for the sound of muffled weeping from many of those present. King Edmund gathered his daughter into his arms, holding her as if he could somehow absorb all the pain she had endured. "I'm so sorry, my little star," he whispered, using his pet name for her that no one had heard since Queen Isabella's death. "I'm so very sorry that I failed to protect you." The formal verdict was almost anticlimactic after such emotional testimony. Queen Margaret was found guilty of systematic cruelty toward Princess Charlotte and abuse of her position as queen. The punishment was exile from the kingdom, with all titles and privileges revoked. She would be escorted to the border and forbidden from ever returning to Valdoria. As the disgraced former queen was led away by the royal guard, she turned back one final time to look at Marcus with pure hatred in her eyes. "This isn't over, Captain," she hissed. "You have made powerful enemies today." Marcus met her gaze steadily, unmoved by her threats. I made the only choice an honorable man could make, Your former Majesty. I would make it again. In the weeks that followed the trial, the kingdom began to heal from the wounds that had been inflicted by Queen Margaret's presence. King Edmund, shocked into awareness by the near catastrophe that had befallen his family, began to emerge from his grief-induced isolation. He threw himself into rebuilding his relationships with his children and restoring the warmth and joy that had once characterized the royal household. Princess Charlotte, freed from the constant fear and criticism that had shadowed her days, began to bloom again. Her laughter returned to the palace corridors, and her curiosity about the world around her was rekindled. She remained close to Marcus, often seeking him out to share stories about her day or ask his opinion on matters both serious and silly. Prince Alexander gained new respect throughout the kingdom for his courageous defense of his sister and his refusal to let political considerations override moral imperatives. The nobility and common people alike saw in him the qualities of leadership and integrity that would serve the kingdom well when he eventually took the throne. For Marcus himself, the outcome was more complex. While he was officially honored for his courage and dedication to duty, he was also keenly aware that his actions had created ripples that extended far beyond the palace walls. Queen Margaret's family and allies had not forgotten his role in her disgrace, and there would likely be consequences to face in the future. But when he looked at Princess Charlotte's bright smile and heard her carefree laughter echoing through the halls once again, Marcus knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he had made the right choice. The protection of the innocent would always be worth any personal cost, and he had upheld the highest ideals of knighthood. The ancient right of shield testimony had served its purpose, proving once again that even in the complex world of royal politics and court intrigue, truth and justice could prevail when brave individuals were willing to risk everything to defend those who could not defend themselves. As Marcus stood watch over the royal family in the months that followed, he carried with him the knowledge that he had not only saved a child from cruelty, but had helped restore the soul of a kingdom that had briefly lost its way. In a world where power often corrupted and position sometimes blinded people to basic human decency, he had proven that one person's courage could make all the difference. The lesson would not be forgotten, either within the palace walls or throughout the kingdom beyond. Sometimes the greatest victories were not won on battlefields or in council chambers, but in quiet moments when individuals chose to do what was right rather than what was easy. When they chose to protect the vulnerable rather than curry favor with the powerful. And in the end, that was perhaps the most royal duty of all, the obligation to use whatever power or position one possessed in service of justice, compassion, and the protection of those who most needed defending.